Hey folks, it's time for another Star Trek video, and because this isn't one of those videos where I scripted it and came up with a thesis and an argument and tried really hard to make it good, we're going to do this not actually Trek Actually style, and I'm going to minimize the effort on my part even further for this one because it's another one of my comment response videos where you, the viewer, have already done most of the work for me, so thank you very much. And now we turn to your comments. These first several comments are from my recent video on Star Trek's evil admirals, and this first comment is from my buddy Serious Mind, who says, I actually think a ban on creating synthetic life forms makes sense. What would be morally repulsive is if the same ban took sanction against existing synthetic life, or prevented the existing synthetic life from creating their own offspring. But to say, hey, we really shouldn't start creating synthetic beings because we're likely to turn them into slaves, that's probably a good thing. As someone who works in automation, I always roll my eyes when I see people trying to make human-like automatons. The whole point of using automation is that automatons do not have the same needs and frailties that humans do. Why on earth try to create something that, if it achieved sapience, would have the same needs and rights as a human being? One might as well employ human beings. Some really good points there. Yeah, you're right. If the ban on synths was Starfleet's way of saying, you know, we're just going to exploit these people, we're going to ruin this, let's just not create synthetic beings in the first place, then yeah, from that perspective, it does seem like in the long run it would be a good thing, right? You know, if you know that you're going to be a terrible parent, not having kids isn't a bad decision, right? It's a very wise, forward-looking decision. So yeah, from that perspective, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. But of course, there's not a lot of story there, right? Next comment is from Aaron Sugar. You forgot one thing in the recap of the Pegasus. During one of the commercial breaks, Riker and Troy popped off to the holodeck to run some Archer to Paul fanfic. Yes, that's right. I didn't mention that. I probably should have. It could have at least been worth a gag or two in my episode summary. The Pegasus is the episode of TNG during which the Riker-Troy portions of the Enterprise finale are set. It is at some point during that episode. I think it's at some point after Riker and Troy's scene in 10 Forward. I think it's at some point after that Riker goes to the holodeck and runs his program about the Archer Enterprise. So yeah. One of the best episodes of TNG, and unfortunately, thanks to that Enterprise finale, it has a connection to one of the less successful episodes in the franchise, let's just say. Yes, the Pegasus. Great episode of TNG. Not ruined necessarily, but diminished a bit by Star Trek Enterprise. Thanks, Rick Berman. This comment is from Mr. Camerite. I actually like the term rogue admirals instead of evil admirals. The reason for this is that every one of the admirals mentioned had the good of Starfleet and the Federation as a goal at heart when they began to use unorthodox methods to accomplish their goals. The term, the road to hell, is paved with good intentions, comes to mind here. For Preston's, it was the development of a defensive system that he viewed as capable of saving thousands, if not millions, of Federation lives, and for Leighton, it was the threat of a war with the Dominion that made him act irrationally. The only truly evil admiral I can see is Commodore O, who we found out was actually a Romulan agent, and even she had reasons for what she did, albeit not very good ones. Boy, that is just the perfect Star Trek comment, isn't it? I really love this comment because that is something that Star Trek over the years, especially during the TNG era, has sort of trained us to do, which is to always try to see the villain's side of it, to see that the bad guys are not purely bad, that they have motives and goals that are understandable, and from their perspective are laudable, are positive. It's just from our hero's perspective, or from the perspective of, you know, an innocent person or a person who stands to be hurt by the villain's action. It's unacceptable and can't be allowed to happen. So that's a very Star Trek response for you to say, actually, the evil admirals aren't that evil. And I do agree with you. I think that rogue admiral is probably a better term. Evil admiral is catchier and more attention grabbing and works better for a title and for a term used in a video. But yeah, rogue admiral is probably more fair and more accurate. Because not only for those reasons, but also, as a couple other commenters pointed out, some of the admirals that I went out of my way in that video to argue were not evil admirals, like Admiral Nechayev, for instance, were still supporting harmful policies, but they weren't going outside the Starfleet command structure. They were representing the official stance of Starfleet. So you could still argue that their actions were evil because they were wanting to do things that would needlessly harm people. But you couldn't say they were rogue because they were acting with the full consent and knowledge of Starfleet. So maybe evil rogue admiral is a better term. Yeah. Here's a comment from Martin Luderschmidt, a video about bad admirals and no Janeway joke. Who are you and what have you done to Steve? Well, I mean, I already gave Admiral Janeway from the series finale of Voyager kind of a hard time in my time travel video. And other than that, like, we see the Admiral Janeway that actually sticks, that is presumably still active in the Prime timeline, which we only caught a glimpse of her in Star Trek Nemesis. And she didn't do anything evil as far as I could tell. Like, she just gave Picard his marching orders for the movie. I mean, she didn't do anything evil. So, like, the evil Admiral Janeway no longer actually exists in the Prime timeline. And I already had some fun at her expense in a previous video. So, yeah, there's plenty of other evil admirals or rogue admirals that I hadn't really talked about that I could talk about instead. So, yeah, give Captain / Admiral Janeway a break, I say. Not because I'm scared of her. Here's one from Wart Rihanna. They nor you ever called it this, Steve, but forced relocation as depicted in Journey's End is very much ethnic cleansing. Starfleet at the start of the episode was complicit in assisting the Cardassians in ethnic cleansing. Even Picard was willing to do it ultimately. It took the bravery of the First Nations chief to say, enough is enough. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And if I wanted to get argumentative with some of the Picard haters, that is the haters of the new series Picard, I could use that as an example of how Picard actually was never as morally pure as some of his more ardent defenders these days seem to think he was. He was not a flat character who was just nothing but doing the right thing and doing the noble thing. I mean, he was clearly a very heroic, very noble character. I did a whole video about him and how admirable he is and you know, how he's really too good to be true. But that doesn't mean he was perfect. And yes, his willingness to go along with the forced relocation in Journey's End at first is a big flaw in his moral armor, so to speak. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. And yes, it is a forced relocation. And I think we're meant to view it that way. I don't think it's accidental that they made the population, the at-risk population in that episode, descendants of Native Americans. That was a very intentional choice by the writers. It was meant to evoke the forced relocation of Native Americans in American history. It was a very, very obvious reference to that. You couldn't miss it. I mean, they were literally Native American. It wasn't like an alien race like standing in for them. It was literally Native Americans who were facing forced relocation. So yes, forced relocation is a form of ethnic cleansing and is by some definitions a form of genocide. And Starfleet was going to be complicit in that. So you can add that to the list of reasons why it's not such a new radical departure to depict Starfleet as a less than perfect organization either. But yes, it's very important to call it what it is. Forced relocation is a form of ethnic cleansing. And twice in Journey's End, and as I mentioned in my video, also on the Baku planet in Star Trek Insurrection. Starfleet was going to take part in a forced relocation of a pre-existing or of a settled population, not a native population in those cases, but a settled, established population. Yeah, not good. Not good, Starfleet. And here's one from Phil Rimmer. I'd be interested to get your take on Admiral Ross. Not really a bad admiral when compared to the others, but still he was willing to work with Section 31 to depose Senator Kretak to gain the loyalty of Kaval, and he was willing to let the Romulans set up arms on a Bajaran moon. So I'd like to know your opinion on the guy. I mean, he's definitely a Deep Space Nine character, isn't he? I like Admiral Ross a lot as a character. And yeah, I would put him in the same boat as someone like Admiral Nechayev when it comes to how he seems to be generally a good person. He seems to want the right thing. He wants to serve the common good, but he is willing to compromise his own principles and to act contrary to the stated principles of Starfleet in order to accomplish that. He has a very pragmatic viewpoint, and I think that was one of the big themes in the Deep Space Nine war stories in its last couple of seasons when it really focused on the Federation-Dominion War. One of the recurring themes of that story arc is that sometimes in order to win, the good guys can't always act like good guys. That sometimes you do have to get your hands dirty and compromise your own principles and your own ethics and open yourself up to judgment and punishment in order that the greater good can flourish and survive. So you have to, I think Sloan said something like this in one of his episodes speaking about Section 31, but it also applies to Ross's actions, that in order to preserve the Federation and preserve what it stands for and all of its liberties and advantages and everything, all the good that it does for people, sometimes some people like him have to work outside of those ethics, have to work outside of that system. And Deep Space Nine is very smart about not condoning it to the point, not saying that these are good guys, not saying that what they are doing is praiseworthy, but having a very realistic view of it and saying maybe it's not praiseworthy and maybe it doesn't make these guys heroes, but what they are doing is necessary, you know, and we can shake our head at it and maybe we should be troubled by it, but it is still necessary for the greater good to continue to flourish. So, I mean, I think Ross is a very important character to that part of Deep Space Nine's message. And I think Ross as a character is fantastic. And I think he's definitely a problematic admiral, a morally complicated admiral in the same way as Nechayev is from time to time, for sure. Don't think I would call him an evil admiral, but definitely a morally complicated admiral. And here's another one from the Evil Admirals video from Jeffrey Moy. LOL, nice rant, but Space Elf is still a stupid character. And I have no problem with Picard being a father figure, but a deadbeat father figure? Nope. Actually, if he even had a family at the start of the series, would have been alright to me. He had a family in Inner Light, and it could have been something he committed to after Starfleet. His abandonment of life, because Starfleet doesn't want him, is the most pathetic aspect of his character. Real-life allegory can be found in Jimmy Carter. This is what kind of character I see Picard would be, but drama. Well, Jeffrey, I'm very sorry to see that you did not enjoy the Picard series. This kind of comment actually, I mean, this is going to come across as condescending, and I guess maybe it is, but I don't mean it that way, but I feel sorry for you. Like, not because you didn't enjoy the show, because, I mean, you can enjoy or not enjoy the show for whatever reason that you enjoy it or don't enjoy it, that's fine. But when you seem to be incapable of enjoying it or of appreciating it on its own terms, simply because it doesn't fit your preset expectations. Like, you seem to have had this box that you drew in your mind of what Picard is, what Picard would be, what situations it would be acceptable for us to find Picard in. And because you judged him to be outside of that box, therefore it sucks. It's unacceptable. I think that's just a really close-minded, rigid way of approaching art. And again, I'm not saying that you have to like Picard, because there are lots of reasons to not like it. But to not like it because you say, well, Picard wouldn't do that, or it's undignified to put Picard in that situation. I mean, what is so wrong? Yes, I think maybe it's a little harsh to call him a deadbeat dad, but yes, he does leave Elnor behind. He does, right? But he regrets that. He feels badly about that. That is a mistake in his past that haunts him and that he feels he needs to atone for when he goes back and he finds Elnor again. So the show acknowledges it. The show just doesn't show us Picard abandoning a young man that he was a mentor to for no reason, or just so we'll know that Picard is a jerk. It gives Picard something to atone for. A lot of the Picard series, a lot of Picard's personal arc in the first season is about atonement, is about Picard getting to a point late in his life and looking back and realizing that he has made mistakes. And now, with the time he has left, he needs to do what he can to correct those mistakes. And yes, it is drama. Absolutely, it's drama. And it's good drama. It's not perfect. There are mistakes in the series. There are things about the series I think it could have done better, including in terms of Picard's story arc. But in general, I think it works. And it's a great idea. And of course, it's drama. It's a drama series. That's why it exists. And to say, well, they shouldn't have had Picard make that mistake, Picard shouldn't have had that character flaw. I mean, I'm sorry that you think there are only a short list of acceptable traits that Picard should have. And I mean, it sounds an awful lot like people who are pissing and moaning about how Luke Skywalker was supposedly mistreated in The Last Jedi. Because, like Picard, he had done things that he regrets. He had made mistakes in his life that he now acknowledges as mistakes and wants to atone for. That's character development. That's drama. That's story. It's not about humiliating a character or making a character pathetic. I don't see how it makes Picard pathetic. It makes him sympathetic. It gives me a reason to root for him. It gives me a reason to want to see him come back and make good. But I don't think it makes him pathetic or weak. You said that he abandons his life because Starfleet doesn't want him, and that makes him pathetic. I don't think that's it at all. The story's not about Picard being pathetic. The story's about Picard owning up to the fact that he made mistakes, that he was negligent in his duties to the Federation, to his fellow people, and to himself. And now he needs to make up for it. That gives the show a place to go. And that's not a bad thing. So again, you don't have to like it. I'm not saying if you don't like Picard, you're automatically this or that, but the reasons that you and a lot of people have expressed for not liking the show strike me as a reflection, not so much of your opinion of the show or things the show could have done better, but of just a very close-minded, rigid way of approaching art, especially approaching art that is a new chapter in a long-standing work that you are already familiar with and that you already like. And I feel sorry for people who are that inflexible, that they already have the box drawn before they even sit down to watch the show. And it's like I said in a previous video, it's like they approach critiquing art as though you're grading a multiple choice test. And whenever it does something that you think is the wrong thing, you go X, take off points for that. And I don't know. To me, watching a movie and criticizing art, it shouldn't be like that itemized. It should be a more supple, fluid, creative approach, but I don't know. That's just me. And last one from the Evil Admirals video, this one from Jonathan Cassells. In this video, you explain your opinion that it's okay if the writers of Picard made changes to the character because they should be free to do what they need to tell the story they need to tell. How do you reconcile that with your criticism of the changes to Picard's character that we saw in First Contact? Changes which were also necessary to the story the creators chose to tell. Well, I see how you might think that there's like an inconsistency there, and I don't know, maybe there is, maybe I'm letting myself off the hook, but I think the writers of First Contact had every right to change Picard's character to fit the needs of their story. In fact, I seem to recall acknowledging that in the video where I talked about it. I may not have liked it or have thought that it was the best thing for Picard's character, or consistent with Picard's character that we had seen up to that point in the TV series, but they had every right to do it, and I understand why they did it. If they wanted First Contact to be a more action-oriented movie and still center on Picard, then you kind of have to, you have to have Picard be more of an action hero. And also, if you want the central drama of First Contact to be Picard's conflict. I'll learn to talk before the end of this video. If you want the central conflict of the movie to be Picard versus the Borg, then it makes sense to bring his trauma from being assimilated back up. Even though it seemed in the TV series that he had mostly dealt with it, it never really seemed to be a recurring problem for him until First Contact. It all makes sense. I completely get why they did what they did. And I think First Contact is a really good movie. So I'm not gonna, I certainly didn't let whatever problem or whatever disagreement I may have had with the writers over the direction of Picard's character stop me from enjoying the movie, because I think First Contact is easily the best of the Next Generation movies. Like, it's not even close. As much as I like Star Trek Insurrection and have repeatedly gone to bat for it, First Contact is easily the best of the 4 next-gen movies. Like, it's not even close. And it's one of the best of all of the Star Trek movies, period. Like, it's definitely top 5, probably top 4 of all of the Star Trek movies. So First Contact is fantastic. And the changes made to Captain Picard to make him into more of a Rambo guy than he was in the TV show. It doesn't bother me that much. And it certainly doesn't stop me from enjoying the movie. Now, these next few comments are from my Best and Worst Star Trek Parents video. And this first one is from With Chrono, who says, I guess Janeway and Tom Paris are pretty bad if the children they had while they were lizards count. Yes, there are a lot of parents that I left out of my Good and Bad Parents video, and most of these comments are examples of that, which I'm happy to acknowledge, because as I said at the end of my Darkest Episodes video, the point of these videos is not to be a comprehensive list of all of the examples. It's for me to give my opinions or to give examples that I think are the most interesting or that are the best fodder for material for the video, the best that I can talk about or joke about or whatever. So there are definitely examples that I left out that I'm happy to acknowledge. And yes, Janeway and Tom Paris as salamander parents. That's a great example, and it's one of my. It's a bit that I did in a previous video where I talked about that episode, and mentioned that those salamander babies are dead, right? Like, they abandoned them on the planet there without their parents. Like, they left their children to die. So yeah, they would, by that reckoning, they would have to be among the worst parents in Star Trek, right? They would have to be. This next one is from Victor Lewis, and we find out Sulu is a dad in Star Trek Beyond. Did you forget Star Trek Generations? For a moment, I did forget Star Trek Generations for a brief, wonderful moment. Here's one from Sozy Summers. No mention of Dr. Bashir's parents. I would say having illegal genetic modifications performed on your child because you didn't think they were smart enough is pretty shitty parenting. You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. Dr. Bashir's parents definitely belong on the shitty parents list. And that's actually one that I feel bad about not at least mentioning, because that's such a good episode. And Bashir's parents come across as such interesting characters. And I genuinely regret not mentioning them, because I do love that episode, and I really like those characters, especially Bashir's dad. definitely. So thanks for mentioning them. Ryan Travis says, no honorable mention for Data. Even the brief moments he had to share were so lovely and poignant. Come on, Vince, get on it. Yeah, Data was a father to Lal in that one episode, and a lot of commenters mention that. And that's fair play. I probably should have mentioned that as well. Again, because that's such an impactful episode. It's a very memorable episode and a very poignant episode, The Offspring, where Data creates a daughter for himself, and is echoed in the Picard series because Soji and Dodge are depicted as being of Data's lineage in some respect. So it sort of calls back to The Offspring and to Lal. So yeah, but please do not address Vince. Vince is not the host of the show. Vince is not the presenter. I am the presenter of the series. So do not, no, Vince. Do not speak to Vince. The Dancing Hawk says, nothing about Joseph Sisko? Not even a mention. I know he didn't play a massive part in the show, but he's still a dad, and we do get to see glimpses of the lessons he taught his son. I agree. That's another oversight on my part. I should have at least mentioned him when I was singing the praises of Sisko and talking, as I have sometimes done, about how I love the three-dimensional quality of Sisko, the multifaceted quality of Sisko, how we see him in different roles in his life. And we see him not only as a father, but also as a son. And his relationship with his father, with Joseph Sisko, is so interesting and so beautiful. And yeah, I should have mentioned it. You're absolutely right. And I should have mentioned it not only because of the relationship with Ben Sisko and the wonderful character of Joseph Sisko, but also because Joseph Sisko was played by Brock Peters, who was a fantastic actor and certainly deserved recognition. So yeah, good catch. Here's one from Renato Corvaro. I always got the impression that Carol never even told Kirk that he had a son. A lot of people apparently had this impression, but no, I don't think that's supported by the film. In Star Trek II, after David and Jim Kirk have their little scuffle underneath the surface of the Regula planetoid, and Kirk goes over to Carol and he says, "Is that David?" So he knows that he has a son. He knows that David exists. And then later on, when he and Carol are talking, Kirk says, "I did what you wanted. I stayed away." So I think it's pretty clearly established that Kirk knew he had a son, knew his son's name was David Marcus, and stayed out of David's life at the request of his mother. So I think all the shit that I threw Kirk for not even knowing what his son looked like or not at least following along with his life from a distance in the video stands. I think Star Trek II tells us pretty clearly that even though Kirk was absent from David's life, he did know that he existed. Here's one from Seventh Swell. Loxana Troi being poorly acted is, I think, the first time I've disagreed with something you've said in one of your videos. I do agree with annoying and usually with terribly written, though. Well, yeah, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. A couple of other commenters expressed surprise at that as well, that I would say that I didn't think Majel Barrett was a very good actor, at least in the role of Loxana. And I stand by that. I do not think her performance, except for maybe a few moments here and there, over the many, many different appearances that she makes as Loxana, I don't think her performance was very good at all. I think it was bad. It's not just like, well, she wasn't as good as Patrick Stewart. I think she was bad. She was doing bad acting most of the time as Loxana. And it's difficult for me to articulate it. I don't believe her. You know what I mean? I don't believe her. I don't believe that she is the person she is portraying. And I know if you don't know what I'm saying, that sounds like a silly observation, because of course, we all know that Patrick Stewart isn't really Captain Picard. We all know that William Shatner isn't really Captain Kirk. But when you're watching a performance, if an actor is doing their job, you're not thinking about the actor. You're not thinking about the fact that they are acting. You're seeing them as their character, and you are accepting their performance as real in that moment. And with Majel Barrett as Loxana, that rarely ever happens for me. I see her acting. She seems phony to me. She seems false to me. And it's not that she's irritating, because she's meant to be irritating. The character is written that way. It's not that she's annoying. The character is written that way. I just don't think she's very good. I just think she's a poor actor in that role. So yeah, I know a lot of people disagree with me, and a lot of people really, really have a lot of affection for the character of Lwaxana, which I acknowledge, and I don't want to argue about, but I personally don't get, because like I said, she is far and away my least favorite character in the entire franchise. But yeah, it's one more thing, I guess, for me and the Lwaxana appreciators to disagree about, because I do not think she is a very good actor in that part at all. This next bunch of comments is from my video on Star Trek's Darkest episode. Here's one from Iranix. For scene only, I nominate Picard in the mud in the episode Family, showing that glimpse of him so utterly broken under his usual facade. That is a great scene. I don't know if I would call that a dark scene. We kind of get into, and a couple other commenters mentioned this, that, you know, dark, like everything else about movie criticism and TV criticism and just art criticism in general, it's all subjective. What I consider dark, someone else might consider something else. What someone else might consider dark, I might not think is that dark. So I don't think the Picard in the mud scene in Family is a dark scene, but it's a very moving scene. And it's a fantastic scene. It's one of Patrick Stewart's best scenes on the entire series. Like, it's a wonderful, wonderful scene. But from my own perspective, I don't think of that as a dark scene. Like, if you ask me to make a list of the darkest scenes in Star Trek, that scene would probably not be anywhere on the list. Blake Hunsley, how is Tuvix not Voyager's darkest episode? The core cast all shrug while poor Tuvix begs for his life, and then Janeway straight up murders him. Now that is a dark scene. That is a dark scene, and a very dark episode. I think the episode itself isn't all that dark, but the ending is extremely dark. And it's not made darker, but it's made maybe a little more frustrating by the fact that the show had absolutely no follow-up with it. You know, like Janeway does this not Janeway and the whole crew, because as you point out, the entire crew is complicit, because Tuvix is forced to undergo this procedure that will bring Tuvok and Neelix back and will kill Tuvix. And he begs for his life the entire time and is clearly not okay with this at all, right up to the last moment. And it still is forced upon him. It still happens. And after the episode is over, like while the episode is on, it's treated as a very grave, very serious, very troubling thing. And then once the episode is over, it's like it never happened. So it's very frustrating. It's one of the best examples of how Voyager and its rigidly episodic format really works against it, because it does these incredibly powerful episodes that should have long-reaching implications for the characters, and it's literally never mentioned again. Or if it is mentioned again, it's mentioned maybe in passing, but it doesn't seem to have any weight after this episode. But yeah, that's a good call. Tuvix is a very dark episode, and especially the ending is an incredibly dark ending. I'm going to do a video about Tuvix, the episode, at some point. I've taken it out of the episode polls the last few months. Maybe next month I will put it back in, and we'll see. Hopefully it will win a poll one of these days, and I'll do that episode. Or maybe I'll just get tired of it and I'll just do it anyway. I'll just get tired of waiting for it to win a poll, and I'll just go ahead and do it as an extra video. But yeah, I'm going to do a video all about Tuvix one of these days. Don't you worry. Here's a comment from Michael Jobert. What got me about Chain of Command was when Madred brought his kid into an interrogation and torture setting. That's brutal. Yes, that is brutal, and dare I say it again and repeat myself, that's dark. Like, it's a great example of how you can do a dark scene, and I mean like tonally dark, like disturbing, upsetting, grim, without having it be violent or bloody or have like a lot of extreme emotion. Like, that's a very understated scene, and the horror of that is only Picard underlines it a little bit after the child leaves, And he and Madred talk about it, and Picard says, you know, to expose a child to suffering like this is wrong. You know, if I had a daughter, I would not expose my child to this kind of suffering. Like, it's a really, really disturbing scene, because you see how normalized this is in Cardassian society. You see that Gul Madred apparently has no moral problem with anything that he has done to Picard. And presumably to other people who got the same treatment before Picard was brought in. Like, he's so comfortable with it. It's so normalized in his reality that he's completely fine bringing his young daughter into the same room as the man he is torturing. He has no problem with that whatsoever. It's a really, really, really upsetting scene. Zachary Davis says, remember that time in TOS when a bunch of children murder their parents and then turn on the Enterprise crew? How about Miri? Oh man, there are so many episodes of classic Trek that I could have mentioned as dark episodes that I didn't mention. Yeah, the ones that I mentioned, I think I still stand behind. But yeah, Miri, the episode you mentioned, what was it? Was it called "And the Children Shall Lead"? We just used that episode as the basis of an Ensign's Log episode. I can't remember the title. City on the Edge of Forever, that a couple other people mentioned in the comments. City on the Edge of Forever is a pretty dark episode in certain respects. I mean, especially in terms of Kirk's story, because he has to allow this woman to die in order to set the rest of history right. So there are so, for as bright and technicolor and goofy of a show as classic Trek often was, there are some seriously dark episodes in that show. There are many, many more than I mentioned. Absolutely. Here's one from Captain Andy. The ridiculous thing about O'Brien having experienced those simulated years in jail and all the psychological damage it causes is that we never hear about it ever again. Every episode after that episode shows O'Brien back to his healthy usual self. No noticeable personality changes, flashbacks, references to how his therapy is progressing, etc., etc. This is an example of how even when Star Trek writers try to break out of the episodic formula and do something with more continuity, they still didn't quite shake off old habits. Yeah, this is a great point, and as someone who often, and just a couple minutes ago I did this, I criticized Star Trek Voyager for doing that. I think Deep Space Nine was much, much, much better than Voyager in that respect overall. But there are still examples where Deep Space Nine does the same thing. And Hard Time, unfortunately, is one of those examples where O'Brien goes through a trauma that would change his life, that would alter his life from that point forward, and would resonate and should resonate in future episodes. It doesn't have to be the kind of thing where it's brought up every time, or it's, you know, part of a multi-episode story arc, but it is something that should at least be mentioned again, should be referenced, should be acknowledged, so that we know, like, this sticks, this experience is still a part of this character's life. And we just get no reference to it ever again, as far as I can remember. I don't think the events of Hard Time are ever brought back after the episode, and that's a big lost opportunity. And the only reason why I didn't make a big deal about it in the episode, and I don't make a big deal about it in general when discussing Deep Space Nine, is because Deep Space Nine didn't do that very often. Deep Space Nine was, in general, much, much better at showing us a reality between the episodes where things that happened to the characters actually mattered and had consequences for them down the line. Voyager almost never did that. So for anybody who's gearing up to write a comment and say, "Oh, Steve, you're letting Deep Space Nine off the hook, but you don't let Voyager off the hook," Voyager did that all the time. Deep Space Nine rarely did it. So yes, Deep Space Nine was still guilty of it. As Andy says, they still had some old habits that they couldn't entirely break. But on the whole, Deep Space Nine was way better at it than Voyager was. Here's one from Aaron Knowles, new patron, Bobby Cox. New headcanon is that retired baseball manager Bobby Cox is a huge Trek fan. He loves two things: getting ejected from baseball games and Voyager. Yeah, and choking in the World Series. What? I'm just saying, the 90s were a great decade for the Braves. You know, until you got past the NLCS, right? 5 World Series appearances, only 1 championship trophy. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. Thank you for your patronage, Bobby. I can't say, look, I can't say shit about the Braves because my team is the Orioles. All right? Like, here's a comment from Kahlo Moraes. You missed off my favorite DS9 episode, The Visitor. Jake loses his father in an accident and ends up spending his whole life trying to figure out how to save him, and in the end, kills himself to save him. And although Cisco makes it back, he has shown just how important Jake's future matters to him, and that without him, it could be shattered. This goes back to what I was saying previously about differing definitions of what constitutes dark. I mean, The Visitor, as I think I've said before in videos, and I know I've said a bunch of times on social media, The Visitor is my favorite episode of any Star Trek show ever. I think The Visitor is one of the best things ever produced in the Star Trek franchise. It's a beautiful episode. It's so good. I mean, I could not possibly emphasize enough how much I love and admire that episode. I don't think of it as a dark episode. I think of it as a very sad episode. I think of it as a deeply moving episode. Like, it moves me damn near to tears every time I watch it. But I don't know if I would call it a dark episode. So it's very much in the eye of the beholder. But yes, I suppose I could have mentioned it. And maybe I should mention that episode more often than I do, you know, because it's just a beautiful episode. It's my favorite Star Trek episode ever. And these last 3 comments are from my video about whether or not Starfleet is the bad guy. And the first one is from Metal Lion, who says, "This is an oversimplification of a larger issue of Star Trek Picard and Discovery. If Starfleet are bad now, it's a larger symptom of the type of view/tone and storytelling Kurtzman Trek wants to tell. It's okay to have some dissent in the ranks on occasion, like evil admirals, but from an overall point of view, Starfleet ought to be a force for good with the best that humanity and their allies represent in the Federation." Well, see, and I don't disagree with that, but I don't see how that precludes showing that Starfleet and the Federation and the best that humanity has to offer can still fall short from time to time. I feel like that's a really, really important message for us to be getting nowadays, especially. I think it's important for us to be reminded that even our very best can sometimes fall short. That even Starfleet, the great institution, the beacon of equality and hope and science in the galaxy, even Starfleet still fucks up big time from time to time. And it doesn't mean that it's no longer Starfleet or that all the good stuff about it no longer exists. It just means that we need to remind ourselves that it's not perfect, you know? Just like maybe some of our cherished institutions are not perfect and actually in real life are pretty far from perfect most of the time, even though we have high ideals for them and want them to be, you know, beacons of truth and hope and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't see how those two things are at odds. You can have Starfleet and the Federation be these utopian institutions, these societies that have overcome most of the problems that we deal with, but you can still show that they are still susceptible to prejudice, to ignorance, to bias, to fear, to being reactionary, to being irrational. Like, that's just part of the human condition. I don't think we will ever escape that. And I think it's completely fair for Star Trek to do shows, to tell stories about Starfleet falling victim to those human foibles that we all have to deal with and that our real life institutions have to deal with and are dealing with right now, often to our detriment. So no, I don't agree with that take. And as I've pointed out before, I mean, it's not as though the idea that Starfleet is less than perfect is something that was introduced by the Kurtzman-helmed shows. Like, that's not new to the franchise. It's maybe being foregrounded a little more. It's maybe being looked at as a systemic problem rather than a few bad apples, but it's not a new thing. And even that, it being more than a few bad apples, like in the Drumhead, Picard warns Worf at the end, we must continue to be vigilant because we are still susceptible to being drawn into witch hunts. Even though we are evolved people, even though we have grown beyond the prejudices and all of the negative things that we had in our past, like, we are still susceptible to this. You know, Picard said, you tell yourself that all of that is in the past, and then in the blink of an eye, it threatens to start up again. Like, that was Star Trek The Next Generation. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, there's that brilliant two-parter past tense where Sisko and Bashir and Dax are thrown back in time to the 21st century that is now 4 years from now. And they see this terrible ghetto where unemployed people are just sort of closed in and left to their own devices. And Bashir says, you know, do you think that we could ever allow something like this to happen again? Like, he does the same thing Picard does at the end of the Drumhead. He sort of muses, like, we tell ourselves that we've grown beyond this, but is that really true? Would we find ourselves in a situation similar to this under the right or the wrong circumstances? So that's not, again, like, they didn't just make that up for Discovery or Picard. That has been a part of the Star Trek franchise from the beginning. They're just hitting that particular beat a little harder or a little more frequently than past shows did. And I have no problem with that. In fact, I think that's great, because I think that's a message that we as a people desperately need right now. Here's one from Phil T. Duck. I suspect Picard was using Reagan-esque shining city on a hill rhetoric to describe Starfleet, especially in First Contact, when the organization was obviously enjoying its golden age. The United States thought of itself in similar terms in the last half of the 20th century. Thing is, though, humans will be humans, whatever century they might live in, always vulnerable to groupthink and mob mentality. And the exploration of the human condition is what Star Trek has always been about. How did you manage to say all that so succinctly and I just rambled about it for the last 5 minutes? And finally, this comment from Satoshi Matrix. But if it's the least shitty option available, what else can you do? Ah, yes, the argument why you should vote for Joe Biden. I'm glad we understand each other. And yet, you're actually, I mean, I'm joking a little bit, but that was intended as an inference to people who are maybe having a little bit of an enthusiasm problem with Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate. You are absolutely spot on. If he is the least shitty option available, what else can you do but vote for him? So I'm glad we understand each other. Whether you agree with it or not, that was absolutely the message I was trying to send with that line. So thank you for pointing it out. And thank you for leaving a comment, which then gave me an opportunity to reference it in a far more explicit way. Even if the only reason to vote for him is that he's better than Trump, that's still a reason to vote for him. And I'm going to. Anyway, that's it for the comments. Thank you all so much, as always, for leaving your wonderful, awesome comments on my Star Trek videos. I really enjoy reading them, and I really enjoy picking a few of them out every couple of months to do these videos. I think these are, are really, this is a good thing to have like an interaction between the creator and the audience. And I really love that you point things out that I missed or are able to make points that I was trying to make better than I made them, or point out things that I left out that I should have talked about more. Like, I think you're fantastic. I cannot tell you how pleased I am with the audience that I have. You guys and you folks, I'll say. I should be using gender neutral terms, not guys. You people, you folks, you, all of you. Whatever you may be, whatever categories you may fall into. I think you're just terrific. And I thank you so much for watching and for participating in this with the creativity and the enthusiasm and the cleverness that you do, because I think it's just awesome. So that's it for this one. I will be back next month. Actually, a little over a month from now will be the next Regulation Trek actually video, which will be about whether or not Star Trek glorifies terrorism, and that'll be a really interesting topic. And there'll probably be maybe a Star Trek video between now and then. I'm not sure what, but there'll probably be something. I don't know. and in between the regular videos that I do that are about non-Star Trek topics. So look for those. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to listen to the Ensign's log. Links are in the description. You can listen to the Ensign's log whenever you want. We're in our 3rd season. It's the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that myself and Jason Harding do, and we're having a blast making it, and we're so thrilled that a lot of you are listening to it and enjoying it, and I love getting comments about the Ensign's log, so check that out. Links in the description if you've never listened before. Patreon.com/Steve Shives if you want to support the work I do on this channel, help me continue making videos like this, ask questions for my Ask Away live streams, vote in the polls that determine future Trek Actually topics. All of that happens at patreon.com/Steve Shives. You can become a patron for $1 a month. And you get access to all the stuff I just mentioned, but $5 a month gets you a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. So if you like what I do here on YouTube, and if you like the Star Trek stuff, and you can afford to help me continue doing it, you know, think about becoming a Patreon patron. I really appreciate it. I could not do this without my Patreon patrons. So there you go. That's it. Thank you all so much for watching, everybody. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you later.